Grief isn't something that we just experience emotionally. It shows up physically through our bodies, and most people are unaware of all of the ways it can actually show up. So on this episode, we are bringing in psychotherapist and trauma-trained expert Meghan Riordan Jarvis to expose what other ways grief shows up physically and how we can work that out of our bodies. Meghan's a great friend of the Good Grief podcast. This is her second time on the show after last year her episode reached number 2 for 2024. You are going to be completely blessed and blown away by what she has to share on this episode, and I can't wait for you to hear it. Hey, welcome back. This is round 2, part 2, take 2. Good to see you.
I'm the luckiest. I'm so happy to be here. I love talking to you.
Last time we chatted, you were releasing or just about to release your book.
Yes.
It's still up behind you.
It is. Yeah. I have my big crazy poster that my publisher sent me. And then I actually don't even have a copy of it with me because I'm about to teach it as a class. So I've been like taking these little tabs and, let's teach that part. Let's teach that concept.
How's it been?
It's good. It's a slow burn when you write a clinical book. It's not the same. When you write a memoir, people suddenly really relate to your personal story, and you hear a lot from people immediately. It's been a wild time over here in the United States.
Yeah, totally.
Our coast burned, and here in DC, we had this horrifying helicopter and plane accident. And we lost a whole bunch of young people.
Yeah.
It's just been a very griefy time. So there's just a lot of like chaos and maybe trauma that's happening. When people write back to me or come to me, what they say is the short chapters are really helpful to them. The plain language is really helpful to them. And the way that it's indexed, where you can kind of use it as a resource, like, why do I have brain
it's
fog?
a tool, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And and every time somebody says that, I'm like, oh my God, thank you. Because those 3 things, that's what I tried to do. And so when people come back with that, I just have a tremendous amount of gratitude for that.
I think it's so interesting how things are created and written for certain times, and you didn't foresee, no one could foresee what happened on the coastline and these accidents and so forth. Yeah. And then these tools become highlighted and become relevant when they're so desperately needed.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is, so there's one chapter in the book that almost wasn't in the book because it will eventually date the book, which is there's a chapter that I put in there, which is like how to know when you need help and how to find the help you need. Because it's really confusing. I'm sure it is in Australia too, but it's really confusing over here. Everybody has different letters after their name and you don't know what they mean. Totally. And what do they specialize in? And what we tell people over and over is that a typical therapist is not necessarily trained in trauma or grief and loss. So you have to know what kind of training they're supposed to have had. And because most therapists would say, of course, I can treat you for grief and loss, but that doesn't mean they're trained to treat you for grief and loss. So the last chapter of the book is one that I called my publishers and said, hey, do you mind if I send this out as because so many people said, how am I going to find a therapist? How will I find one? I've had people from the UK call and say, can you just give me the name of the national organization that helps people find therapists? There's no national organization to help people find therapists.
Nothing. Yeah.
No. So this one chapter that almost didn't make it in the book, I mean, I've probably sent it out daily.
Wow.
Like I sent it out to half the Justice Department.
Wow.
Yeah. So that, the world surprises you, and how your work is useful or impactful surprises you. So I'm glad I stuck that chapter in there, because it was almost like I was being efficient. People call me and say, hey, can you find me a therapist in North Carolina? Someone who does grief and loss. And what I do is I go to this resource, Psychology Today. I put in the zip code, I use the filters, and that's how I find a therapist. So, because I don't know anybody in North Carolina.
Yeah.
So totally. I just taught people, this is how you do it. All I'm doing is this, you go do that. And you will have as good as an answer as I could give you.
Oh, you're amazing. I mean, that is it's such a maze when you try and find someone.
It's such a maze.
Yeah. I was just thankful that our therapist has a deep desire and passion in that space. And so I was like, oh my goodness. But that was like sheer, you could call it coincidence or luck, but I'm going to call it, just God leading me to the right person.
Absolutely.
Thankfully, but that's not the case for everybody. And I totally appreciate that. So I just wanted to say congrats because I haven't seen you face to face since you released the book. So that's so exciting and yeah, just interesting to hear your take compared to a memoir, how different that type of a release is. And
it's different.
How it serves.
And it's different. And also the publishing industry treats it differently. So I was a little savvier this time around. Putting out a book can make you feel really vulnerable. And I had such a good experience with my memoir, but it was still hard. And so I knew how to, I did not do a book tour that had, 35 book stops. I did not do that this time around.
Sure.
I didn't, nobody asked me to, and I wouldn't have said yes. So that, I was able to sort of do a better job for the things that I could anticipate this time around.
Well, for everyone listening, I'll put the book link below as well so that people can continue picking that up. Today, I was shooting you a message. I really want to chat because about the physical devastation that grief brings. Because what we've been hearing from a lot of our audience just recently, these topics and emotions, they come like waves, and each wave is a different one. Right now, what we're hearing is the physical symptoms of grief. Comments from our community saying things like, it feels like I've lost a limb. It feels like half my heart is gone. Totally. My body feels numb. It's cold. It's nauseous. Yeah. And these are things, some that I experienced, some that I didn't, but I saw in my mom and everyone is so different. So I want to break this conversation open because I think a lot of people just feel like they're weird. Why do I feel like this? You know?
Absolutely.
So maybe we can start there. How sort of you've seen grief and experienced grief manifest really in the body.
Yeah. So let's do a quick little review of neuroscience because I think it's really helpful. And every time I say that, I'm like, if my 13-year-old self could hear me say, I'm going to give you a quick review of science, since that was not my strength.
Let's do it.
I just have to pause for that. But let's do a quick review of the neuroscience because it's really important. And I think it gives people relief to understand that you are not going crazy in your physical body. So the way in which we process information in our brain begins at the base of our brain, and it's instinctive. It codes information: 0, no threat; 1 is a threat. The minute it starts to see a threat, it begins to enlarge our instinctive response in our limbic system, our amygdala, which are these 2 little almond-shaped parts at the base of our neck. And when it does that, it almost is as though the energy inside our brain and body goes to enlarging those 2 little parts of our brain, and therefore cannot go to the other places where it would typically land. So I think I've used it before, but the metaphor that I always say is it's like a tree falls down or the bridge washes out, and the mailman with all the typical messages can't get to the houses with the mailboxes.
Yeah.
So then the people in the houses that get the wrong mail from the mailman or have to pick it up off the ground or don't get any messages at all about how their brain is meant to function, those people, the parts of our brain, then send bad messages back down into the body. So, and that happens on this one nerve, which is our 12th cranial nerve, the vagus nerves. The vagus nerve is this super highway that sends messages from the body up into the brain and then the brain down into the body. So when the brain is in trauma, and my guru for this is Mary Frances O'Connor, and I'll give a little plug because her book is coming out next week, and it's called The Grieving Body. It's very different than what I love that
you don't have your book there, but you've got hers.
Isn't that ridiculous? Awesome. I am doing a book that is ridiculous. This is why I'm not good at my job. I can't sell my own books, but I have Mary Frances's here. This book is incredible, and it answers a bunch of questions like, can you die of a broken heart? Things that people talk about in that sort of. She's talking about the physiology because her first book was The Grieving Brain. We talk about it really differently. So it's not like you could, don't just buy her book or just buy my book because the physiology and the way that we think about it is different. But for people that are really struggling, these are two books that now you can put in your hands that will answer some of these questions. I think the thing that's the most important to know is that we have 12 physical systems in our body. And those physical systems are each subject to be impacted by any trauma. So that trauma could be childbirth, that trauma could be cancer, that trauma could be a car accident, but any impact on the system. And what Mary Frances talks about so beautifully in her first book is that the disorientation of the loss of an attachment is so profound, so confusing for the brain. It takes a long period of time for it to upload the data, right? A minute ago, you and I were talking about the Palisades burning down. Yeah. Part of what is so confusing about being in the Palisades, and I was there, is that there are no landmarks. There are no houses, no trees. So even when people are going back to find their houses, they are not sure if they're in the right place for a while. There's no landmarks. There's no way to orient yourself. And for profound loss, that's what's happening. It's like the stars in the sky went out and you have no way to navigate.
That is the best recent relevant analogy. Wow. No landmarks in our life.
Right.
You know, I mean, yeah, totally. I think about before they died, after they died. That's right. a huge one. But then your memory, everything gets absolutely messed up.
Yeah. And this is a little bit like, so I grew up on the ocean. And so I had that experience that some of us have when you're in a small plane or you're out on a boat where like you're looking at a territory that you know very well from a great distance. Mm-hmm. And when you aren't sure how far you are or whether that tree is the tree that borders your property or somebody else's property, you can feel very lost.
Oh yeah.
You can be miles away from where you're supposed to be. And if you think of primary attachment as like that person is a giant oak tree that you orient yourself, you know how close you are to home, you know how many minutes it's going to be, you know, without the oak tree, it's very confusing. And so you feel anxious and you feel worried and you feel out of sorts and you feel lost. And that energy ends up headed down into your physical system. So the 12 systems are things like your respiratory tract.
Yeah.
Your endocrine system.
Yeah.
Your digestive tract, right? Your muscular skeletal system. So those systems end up showing the grief. So people will have lower back pain or upper back pain or their arms will ache. But because we don't tell anyone, that's really normal. I had what I call low muscle tone. I felt like my torso weighed 1,000,000 pounds. My legs felt normal, my arms felt normal, but I just felt like I was like one of those CPR dummies, like just this giant, thick torso. And I felt so heavy in my system after my mom died. But people will, they won't have their period for a year because their reproductive system, or they will have, their respiratory system. They'll have panic attacks because they'll have tightening in their chest. And I had a pediatrician say to me once, I have 3 kids. One kid had febrile seizures. So when she was sick, she got very high fevers and then she would have a seizure. She grew out of them. But I had never seen it before. And so, I mean, I think I had seen it in the emergency room, but never like in front of me. And the doctor was like, nope, this is just the way your kid gets sick. Another one of my kids had strep throat, ear infections all the time. And another one of my kids had rashes and eczema. And, so I would know he was getting sick because he would get like splotchiness on his skin.
Sure.
And I think about that a lot because pediatricians are trained to sort of say to parents like, look, the strep virus can show up in a kid's body by making them not walk. That's actually a thing. Some kids end up having strep is inside their system and for a couple of days, they can't walk. But if you don't know that, it's freaking terrifying.
Totally. Yeah.
Right? It's totally terrifying. And so we have done this abysmal job of acting as though grief is just sort of this emotional longing that we have. We just wish this person was back. And so our heart hurts a little bit instead of what we know is there are actual physical ailments, and there are actual physical repercussions, things like not being able to sleep and not being able to eat. Your hair, you're falling out, your skin and your nails getting really brittle. I mean, that's because that's your hair, your skin, and your nails are all one of those 12 systems. But without scripting, we grieve with our bodies to what we know the impact of grief really is, right? So we do both. We don't do the biology class that well. Like last time I learned about that stuff, I was in like 7th or 8th grade. And we don't do the, hey, what are the common symptoms of grief and loss? So I try to cover them in the book. I talk about migraines, and I talk about back pain, and I talk about the things that people would come in with thinking like, oh, maybe it's my glasses, or maybe it's my workout. Maybe it's your glasses, or maybe it's your workout, but also maybe it's grief. And that they would always say, I don't think so. And I'd be like, well, I do think so.
And the I don't think so they can be immediately in grief and loss, or it can be years after. It can still be showing up.
Yeah. And the other thing that's really difficult about the fact that people don't know it is that they will suffer with these symptoms for a really, really long time before they go and see someone. Like, I don't know, if I had a sore elbow, I don't think I would wait a year thinking it was just going to resolve on its own. I might wait a month, but my assumption would be somebody can tell me about this muscle group and what I did to it. And they can tell me whether or not I need intervention, or whether or not I can just like wait it out, and I'm old and it's going to take a minute, but it will take care of itself on its own. And because we don't offer that to people, I think they are more likely to either go to a medical provider and not even mention that they had a grief experience. And so, and the medical providers are often not trained to even care about that, but they won't mention it because they don't know to mention it. And they'll get medical intervention, right? They'll be going to physical therapy, or somebody will be giving them a new set of glasses, and now we're kind of doubling down on like, oh, but I still have the migraine.
It's not addressing it.
Yeah.
I think one of the lessons I'm still continuing to learn is, even though it's 13 years on, that I'm more aware now when something shows up in my world to just question, hey, is this actually grief surfacing in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah.
And I think for many years you just don't know what you don't know. And then you start to go, maybe this is grief, even though I wouldn't think it is, because I hurt myself and things go wrong all the time with my body. But maybe, what if we just get a little bit curious and just ask?
What's really interesting to me, and I may have said this to you the last time we talked, is this crossover, and partly it's from my own personal experience, but the crossover of the population who are caring for aging and dying parents. So in my sort of quick looking at the data, that's people starting like in their late 30s into their early 60s. That's the sort of age group of people. And that is the catchment area for women who are going through menopause as well. And so menopausal symptoms are nearly identical to grief and loss symptoms. So I've been doing this recent deep dive into like neurotransmitters and hormones and what gets disrupted, not because I don't know that I'll teach that as a class, but I'm really interested in sort of like, okay, those cartoons where like the one character hits the other one with a frying pan and the other one is like this. I'm really interested to know, when you get hit by a frying pan, what are you at risk of? Because my experience was I went into early menopause when my dad died, but I am a grief and loss specialist. So it was a year. I was only 43, which is kind of early. It was a year before I was like, shit, I haven't had my period in a really long time. And you know what else? I keep waking up at 3:00 in the morning. I had been saying all of that was only grief. And then I went to a specialist, which was a little tricky to find, although that's changing in this country. People are focusing on it now because of some really amazing, strong voices. But I went and had my hormones adjusted by taking a hormone patch, and all of a sudden I started sleeping.
Wow.
So it's not as though we can say this is a grief symptom and only a grief symptom. It's that we have to look at the physical body and actually have some wisdom and work in partnership with other specialists to sort of say it's a grief symptom, because I really do think my menopause was brought on by my dad's death.
Sure.
But I still was in menopause, I was still menopausal. I still needed all the other interventions that you would offer someone.
How much more confusing can life be?
Right, I know.
At that time. Seriously.
Correct.
What the heck?
Yeah. But I think, so part of what I've been talking about recently, I dare not even say the 5 stages of grief, but if I were going to talk about stages of grief, like meaning that there are certain elements that are distinct, I do think there are periods of time in our grief where what we really are talking about as our grief collective, as what is making up our grief, is central nervous system dysregulation. Mm-hmm. Meaning we are just really symptomatic, and that our little window of tolerance, as Dan Siegel talks about, has gotten very small. So the way that we're kind of flexible and able to just sort of go with the flow has gotten really small because of the trauma that we've been through.
Yep, the smallest things have set us off.
Early grief is very physical on account of that. And it does feel like I have no arms. And it does feel like I have a hole in my chest. And it does feel like my body is not normal. And I remember, I may have said this to you before, like I couldn't handle overhead lighting. It was like too bright in my eyes. I had to I think I bought like 30 different sets of sheets because I couldn't figure out if I needed the sheets to be softer or more rough. But it turns out I ended up getting linen sheets, but I couldn't let my skin be on fabric that didn't feel exactly right.
And then how much of that was, again, the menopause and the grief?
Yeah.
Like that's,
I will never know. Although by the time my mom died, I had been in menopause for a hot second.
Right.
And
you could tell by that stage.
Yeah. I had a better sort of hunch of how, for me, my primary dysregulated, the primary way that my body reacts with dysregulation is my digestive tract. Mm-hmm. It shuts all the way down. I can't eat for days. I end up having to eat like you would, I don't know, feed a cancer patient or something with like just basic nutrition. And it is a little bit like an alligator snapping out of the water. Like I don't see it coming. And then all of a sudden I feel it inside my body. It feels like an engine starting or like being scraped across the ground. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to be eating for the next couple of days. And my family kind of knows how it goes. And I know how to invite my digestive tract sort of back into calm. But that's the primary way that it shows up. And sleep. I will wake up at 3:00 in the morning and not be able to go back to bed.
Yes. Yeah, totally. That was me as well. Sleep. I didn't suffer physical symptoms that I'm aware of in terms of the numbness, the pain and those sorts of things. But looking back, I think digestive is probably one that does affect me. And I know that because if I'm nervous if someone's nervous, you go to the toilet, right?
Great. That's it.
That's a real simple one to understand. So if we can think that, I've had that all through my life, well, grief's going to affect us probably as well. But my mum, I just remember so vividly her saying, I just feel so numb that you could have probably cut her with a knife and she wouldn't have felt it. That's how the body just felt. And even just talking about that now, my body has a physical reaction.
Visible. So what's interesting about that, and for people who say that they run hot, they feel cold all the time. I hear that a lot, or they suddenly feel like a flush of heat. And the numbness is here too. And again, like I don't always teach this because it doesn't always matter for people to know this, but that's your hypothalamus. So your hypothalamus regulates your temperature and sort of your sense of your perception inside your body. Mm-hmm. And the hypothalamus absolutely is not being invenerated when your amygdala is enlarged. Where the hypothalamus is in the brain and what it's above the thalamus, hypothalamus, it is absolutely impacted. And so it is so common for people to feel freezing cold, or to not be able to tolerate heat in a room, or not be able to tolerate the wind or cold drinks, And I think it's comforting for some people to know, like, look, you got hit by a frying pan. One, it's like you have a concussion. One of the impacts is your hypothalamus is not functioning 100% right. So same when people have absolutely no sex drive, zero sex drive, right? So the two things that sort of drive a lot of the symptoms in our bodies are the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. So the idea is sex drive, there's probably some component of your system that is being understimulated and you are not getting the regular messages that your body would have had. Now, it's not always that people don't want to have any sex. There's something that's called widow's fire. That's what they colloquially call it.
Yeah, I've never heard of that. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so widow's fire means people who are just absolutely craving sex, craving sexual relief, craving intimate connection. And it could be that that's like a biological drive. You know, someone has died and so we're supposed to repopulate the earth. I have talked to a lot of widows about it and they will tell you it is like an energetic surge inside their body.
Interesting.
And it's written about some wonderful writers. Rebecca Wolf, she wrote a book called All There Is, and she writes beautifully about this, about when her husband, who she was estranged from, is dying. The only thing that brings her relief is sexual connection. And Rob Delaney writes a beautiful chapter in his book, the actor who wrote about his son Henry dying, when his son was having this, you know, life-saving at that time surgery, but Henry didn't live much longer. He and his wife go to a hotel room and just have sex all day.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, I think for some people that is appalling. The whole notion of it is like, oh my God, how could that be the case? But for the people for whom that energy is really alive, it makes perfect sense to them.
Well, they only feel uncomfortable because we don't talk about the truth, you know.
Yeah. I hadn't heard of widow's fire.
Yeah.
I was working way back in the day with a woman whose husband had died by suicide, and almost immediately she started sleeping with her personal trainer. And I remember being like, what is this lady doing? And her really describing to me, like, I'm telling you, this is the only thing that's good for me. This is like drinking water. I know I'm supposed to do this. And I don't think I was judgmental. I mean, I was young. Who knows I was. I just was like, this is the weirdest behavior I have ever seen.
Because it doesn't fit the mold,
out it's
right?
Not weird.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because we've got this mold that we've all been fitted to, and that's what we're breaking. We're breaking on this conversation.
We're trying, man. I tell the truth. You and I say the same thing, which is like all the stupid lies that happen in grief and loss. Like we can just tell the truth. Seriously,
yeah. So I wonder, is there an opposing behavior than widow's fire? Because I know for a lot of women it's the complete opposite. It's like I could not even think about anything like that.
And I think that's the one that's more common and that people talk about is like that they don't want to be touched, that all the things that, you know, there's an incredible book by a woman called Emily Nagoski called Come As You Are, which is all about female desire and how it actually physically, the physiology of desire for women is different than it is for men. Totally. And then a lot of it actually is more about imagination and mind and less about sort of.
Hopefully we've learned that by now in our 2000,
right,
25.
that we know this. Right. Although, I mean, I'll tell you, like her book talks about accelerators and brakes and sort of how you can move through, not necessarily dysfunction, but what feels like maybe reluctance inside your body by understanding the parts better. And again, what I would say is there are absolutely people who feel as though like the door just shut and that there's no sexual desire, that there's no energy for that those parts of their body don't seem to, have any warmth or blood flow or any of that. And I do hear that kind of deadening. And often people aren't just talking about sexuality. They might also be talking about like exercise or pleasure in food or, and it's super common.
Sure. And you mentioned exercise. I was already thinking that because I know when my sex drive is low, it's often because I haven't been exercising often enough for my body. And so exercise then also, if we talk about practicalities of processing or letting
Yes.
some of this grief out. Last time we were talking about metal music, if you remember,
Yeah. Love it.
and you were
I
like
love it.
loud,
I was
loud
shocked to
noises.
discover your metal band history.
So let's just talk about maybe some of those ways to relieve some of the tension, the pressure.
Yeah. So if you think about one of the elements of grief being that your central nervous system is really dysregulated, and that happens really repetitively in the early days, but it will happen. It's being triggered, as we call it. I like to call it flooded by emotion, is part of just being a lifelong griever. What we know, and I define grief as the energy that's created inside your body on account of loss, right? So it's this energy that you are responsible for. So the first thing you kind of have to know is, what is the energy? What kind of energy is it? Is it more active energy? So it's making you're tending more towards like the anxious or the active or the overactive. I know lots of people, myself included, where some of my grief symptoms are like overproducing, overdoing, because
do you think that aligns with like the type A? Does that align, do you see? Or it could just be an effect of grief?
It's a good question. Do I think it? So Ken Doka, who has studied this, would tell you that it aligns with gender, that that over functioning, which he calls sort of like the female version of grieving, to be intuitive grieving. So it's more emotional and it's more processing emotion, and that more functional, like the doing of things, and less emotion and more thinking is more a masculine way. I wasn't involved in his studies. I don't know if I think that's true. Plus, I'm not sure I think gender is binary. But I do think there are people who are really shocked to discover that they have always been a moderate, they don't overdo things, and suddenly they're more anxious than they ever were before.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I think it's attached to type A or not, because I think sometimes that is what scares people, is suddenly they don't feel like themselves because they haven't done anything functional and they've been sitting on the couch for 30 days. And they don't know who they are because normally, they're the one who gets everything done, or vice versa. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Very interesting. That's one, like, I mean, speaking to, thousands of women now in our community, it's quite interesting, because what I would probably notice is that you got stuff that you have to get done and you get it done, but things that they're the needs, I have to maybe put food on the table for my family. I have to clean the house after them. But then the wants become really difficult.
Yeah.
So it's not like they switch into gear from what I'm hearing. Like, I'm going to go out there and run the marathon that I always wanted to run, or, those things, or volunteer. Even just yesterday, speaking to one of our members, I'd like to volunteer, which is a want. I think it'll be good for me, but making just the smallest step towards that's very, very difficult.
But that's such a good point, because I think, again, like being able to sit with the energy. So I've talked to you about this before, but we teach this curriculum called the Grief Mentor Method. And the very first element of the Grief Mentor Method is about mindfulness. Not because I'm trying to espouse the idea of everybody doing self-care, but because in order for you to attend to your grief, you have to know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to feel it inside your body, and you have to be able to sort of give it what it wants. Otherwise, you're just going to be following the direction of your friend whose dad died, and he's going to tell you that, he found swimming helpful.
This
and then you're
worked for me,
swimming. Yeah. And it's like, I hate swimming. That's not going to work. I mean, a lot of us do that anyway. It's very difficult when we're grieving to know what's going to help us. So in the Grief Mentor Method, it's really this experimentation. But part of what is really required is for you to be able to say, where is the energy in your body? What does it feel like? Is it still? Is it moving? Does it have a color? Does it have a size? Just being able to attend to it. And then we do that thing, which is, okay, what does this energy, what will be supportive of this energy? And you'll notice I don't say like what will make it feel better, or what, because sometimes we actually need it needs to feel worse. We've been not feeling it enough. But you may find like swimming a perfect thing for you. You may
Totally.
find that what is more supportive is painting.
Yep.
You may find, so there are some basics, which is like, I do think that some regular exercise, and by exercise, I just mean walking.
Yeah.
I do think that is, you have to get some movement in, you have to move. Otherwise you're at the risk of sort of the energy kind of like sticking inside of you.
And that's good general advice in life, like,
yeah, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about in the grief mentor method really is like, this is just good for you.
Yes.
But we're really focused on doing it so that when the person has done these mini experiments, like, okay, so I'm going to go to a museum and see if the energy responds to being in front of paintings. And like, does it like Monet, or would it rather, modern art? Like, is art, a lot of the people that I work with are like, no, I went to the museum and I was like, what the hell am I doing here? So it's like, great, that's great information. Art is not it. Or they'll
off the list.
Music, as we talked about, or they'll get outside, or they'll go and spend time with a friend. And I love when people come back and say to me, something like you just said, which is the thing that's been the most meaningful is going to the soup kitchen, or the thing that's been the most meaningful is volunteering at my son's daycare, or working in the community garden, or praying, or being part of Evensong, or I can't prescribe that because I don't know, but I love being in the curious conversation with somebody and saying, let's see if we can figure it out. Like, let's see if we can figure it out.
Yeah, I think for people tuning into this conversation, that just that word curiosity alone is going to help open so many opportunities through grief. And I love what you're saying here. Like, you are a psychotherapist saying that I can't prescribe, just because there could be so many different ways. We have to find, and I think that's one thing about grief is like, one, when we're thrown into it, we weren't prepared for it anyway, and we didn't want it and we didn't invite it. Two, it becomes an experimentation, which life was great beforehand. Why do we need to now experiment all of a sudden? Life becomes complicated. But it is about, I love that idea of just trialing, just go to the museum or try painting. But the painting, or swimming might be the worst thing, because now you're it's silent, you can't think, and you might need the noise and the loud stuff. What I was going to say as well is a lot of our, we've got a lot of dog mums in our Good Grief Club, and you've got Winston, the chocolate lab. And
chocolate lab.
We were just talking about this yesterday on a call, that we were just talking about the idea of accountability through grief, and pulling in a friend that can help hold you accountable. If it is the soup kitchen, right, and it's too hard, invite your friend to say, hey, would you call me on that day to see if I made the phone call, like the first step. But what we were just discussing is how, because we don't have a dog, right? But Kaylee's had dogs throughout her childhood. Dogs keep you accountable. They need to be walked, and they will wake you up, and they will get you out of bed, or they will snuggle in. And just that accountability is like a support network you can't buy anywhere. And so for all of the dog parents out there, you're already, on the right track if you're grabbing the dog out the door.
There's some data out there that says that when you ask a griever what has reliably helped them the most, it is a pet. That is what they need, right? Because pets don't require you to stop crying. They don't require you to show up to a Christmas party you don't want to go to.
And they love you 100% of the time.
Yeah. And they're often really attuned to your moods. Yeah. And so they will show you a lot of compassion. I think a TV show that does this really beautifully is Afterlife with Ricky Gervais. It's about the death of his wife. And his relationship with his dog is the most deeply loving that he shows. And I think that's actually true of the actor. Although I think he loves cats. I think people who understand that pets allow us to kind of plug back into love. And, there's data out there that, like, the same way that when you put your baby on your chest, your heartbeats syncopate. And when your baby goes on your wife's chest, it actually remembers her heart from hearing it. Neuroscientists have done all this incredible data about that. There are ways in which in grief, like, you can sit back to back when you're overwhelmed with a friend, And if they will breathe deeply, your breath will begin to match their breath. So they're able to like physically offer you a kind of calm that maybe you wouldn't be able to tolerate if they hugged you. Like that might be too much. But the way in which we pet a pet and we get a little hit of the good oxytocin. Kind of neuro, the oxytocin and the serotonin that allow us to sort of feel calmer.
Yeah.
And there are certain animals. Horses are one, wolves are another, dogs are another, cats do it too.
Horses are really special.
They just know. They know, and so, and they use their sympathetic nervous system to partner with yours.
You want to know something crazy? We had a previous client in Canada. She had a station there with horses and all sorts of things, and she would bring business owners onto her station, and they would have retreats there. And as she coached these business owners through setting goals and intentions and building out their vision for their business, she would then get them to walk alongside a horse each and share those dreams and those ideas with the horse. If the horse turned away and walked away from her, the horse would know that they didn't believe and fully embody what they were saying.
Totally.
And just blows my mind. A little bit off track, but it just goes to show just the power of having a pet.
I don't think it is off track. I mean, I think it's totally on track, because I think we have to reach for whatever helps us and to not assume that in my memoir, End of the Hour, it's not spoiling anything because it's on the back cover, to say to people that I ended up, after my mom died, I ended up with such severe PTSD symptoms that I ended up checking myself into an inpatient facility that I was really familiar with. I had sent many clients. I knew they had equine therapy there. I knew that was like the tool that they used. I had been down for professional days. I grew up with horses, and my attitude about horses were like, fuck horses. They're just horses. Like, I'm not interested in this. So when I get down there and I write about it, the very first thing, of course, I get on my little schedule is equine therapy. And I'm like, for the love of Jesus. And the chapter is really powerful because I was terrified. I had just gotten to treatment. I was terrified that I was going to lose my whole life because I couldn't function. I couldn't even walk up the hill. I didn't have enough energy inside my body to walk up the hill. So this guy in a golf cart came and drove me like the length of a car. I mean, it was no distance, but I couldn't get up there. It's part of the program. I mean, they know that I was not the first person not able to get up the hill.
For sure.
And when I was up there, I mean, I won't spoil the whole chapter. People can go read it in End of the Hour. But what happened was I was asked to brush the horse with 2 brushes. And I am a clinician, so I know that when you move both sides of your body, you're actually doing bilateral stimulation. So I knew this. But as I was sitting there, the instructor was just sort of saying, like, just notice whatever comes up, notice whatever comes up. And for the first time in 3 months, my brain just offered this little thought, which was, it's going to be okay. And it was the first time I had the thought and believed it. I was like, oh my God, it is going to be okay. But right up until that second with this horse that sort of magically came over to me and moved its body close to me so that I could brush it with my hands, all the energy inside me shifted from like complete despair to just 2% possibility that there's something. I couldn't have said I'm going to have a good life. I couldn't have imagined where I am now, but I just was like, maybe it's not all going to be impossible darkness forever.
And I think that's what people have come here to hear on this episode. It's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And even though it might not seem like it, I would love for people to borrow from our hope right now,
Always.
from our belief, from our experience that it's going to be okay. It's going to be different, but it's going to be okay. Something my mum, this was before even my dad died, but she'd always say this to me. She'd say, Ryan, it's going to be okay in the end. And if it's not okay, it's not the end.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. That's
good. And I've taken that through small challenges and big challenges, but it's just something. And, it's one of those cliches, but it's just something that just provides.
I hate it because if you said it to me, people did say it to me. when I was in my darkest place, I just sort of was like, fuck you. How do you know? It's not going to be, how do you, but that's why I think telling the stories and hearing from the voices, because look, I mean, what I would have loved to have done was mine all the experiences of all of my clients who grieved over the 22 years and come up with the magic formula. Or at least the magic compass points. If you can just live 122 days after your loss, then then begins spring, and then the little sprouts of hope will grow. There's no such thing as that. When you ask grievers, how did you survive this? How did you survive? I mean, I have worked with people who lost multiple members of their family in the same car accident. That, things, and their home. When I was speaking to people who lost things in the fire, they lost their community, they lost their school, their library, they lost their house, their son lost their house. I mean, it's just the compound loss is, when you think about it, you're like, nope, nobody can survive that. And when you ask those people how they did it, years down the line, when they get remarried or when they rebuild, they say, I don't know. They say, I don't know. There wasn't one thing. I just didn't die.
One foot in front of the other.
I just didn't die from it. Yeah.
It kept going.
So it's that. I mean, when people are like, how am I going to do it? I'm like, in very little steps, just like 2% more. So even when someone says, I know that I really want to be able to go volunteer, but I can't. What I say to them is, but you're opening the possibility today. Like, you just opened the Ziploc bag. And so if you can just let yourself want to, maybe tomorrow you'll be 2% more able to. And then one day you might be able to. But we don't have to be able to right away. It's all sort of preparatory movement.
Which has been the way life was before we came across loss. When we wanted to learn an instrument or how to drive or any of the things that we've learned how to do, we weren't able to do them immediately. It's just another learning curve that unfortunately we have to walk through.
For many of us, we're doing that with the deep concern of the people around us that also feels like criticism and judgment. There are not that many times in our adult life where we are learning in this kind of acute way, right? Totally. Like, I admire people who are like, I'm 40 and I'm skiing or ice skating for the first time, or I'm doing, it's like, wow, that's awkward and it doesn't look good, and I hope you don't get hurt. But I am not a person.
Lessons. Yeah,
I'm not a person that, if I was going to do that, I would get the ski slope to close so no one could look at me. And
we know how hard it is learning things the older we get.
Right.
Like, even me now, I'm kind of going, it's way harder learning. I'm playing a new sport right now. And I'm like, in my mind, paddleball. Have you heard of paddleball?
Oh yeah. We've got
not pickleball, just to be very
paddleball
clear.
It has the flat, thinner. Yep.
And it's got glass balls. Anyway, it's like, in my mind, I still feel 18, 25, the prime of my sporting life, but I'm 35, and the guys that are 50 are beating me because they've learned the skill, they've played it. And I'm like, in my mind, it doesn't make sense because I can pick up things and sport quickly, but it's harder. It's much harder. And so that's where we're coming out from grief here.
Yeah. And I think, imagine if while you're learning to do that, people are watching you not get the ball and saying, I think he's kind of doing it wrong.
Honestly.
I think instead of like, Ryan's he'll get it. He's just, he's still learning.
Supporting. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, what we hear, and I always use puberty as sort of puberty is this terrible time where kids are trying to find an identity and get it to stick. And, you want to reach out to them and be like, those clothes aren't the right clothes, or like, I get what you're trying to do with that haircut.
I wish I could have said that to myself.
I know. But we all know, we don't look at those kids and say like, wow, you're really failing at developing.
Yeah,
what we say is like, this is a shit awkward time. So sorry. Like, I'm so, and then we show them, we pull out our own pictures where we're like, let me show you what I look like in 8th grade, right?
It's awful. Let me take a photo so you can remember it. Yeah.
It's terrible. But we don't look at them and say like, oh God, I think maybe they should go see a therapist because they're really not doing a good job at it. And I think that's really important to say to the folks that are listening, like, grief does not require therapy. It doesn't. For most people, mine did. Mine qualified more like an illness. I was really unwell. I was unwell in my body.
Sure.
And I write about it in my book so that people can sort of like, well, when do I need to see a treatment provider? For the vast majority of folks, they just need to make some shifts. They just need more support. They just need time to learn, and they need to not have people around them wondering if they're screwing it up because they're still having trouble sleeping 3 months out. Those people need to be better educated about the realities of grief and keep their damn mouths shut.
Which we're working on. And, so grateful for the good things that social media brings, and that we're able to share some of these thoughts and ideologies around how to help and support grievers. And I mean, even on that, like some people, yes, therapy, some people not, in your own family. So my experience was I encouraged and I took mum by the hand, and eventually we went and saw a beautiful counselor who had experienced loss herself, and against my mum's will, but in the end was the right thing. But beautiful. I still went to the sessions on my own, but didn't need them anywhere as near as much as what mum needed them. And that's in the same household, and so it just goes to show how much it varies.
Yeah. I mean, I checked myself into an inpatient facility. I have 5 brothers and sisters. Nobody else did that. So there isn't one right way, and there isn't a one way that it's going. Everybody who loses the same attachment. I lost my mother, they lost their mothers, but all the ways in which my life had navigated loss was also involved in what that experience was like for me. And there was a reason for me why it was so hard, and why other people, I mean, I think others of my siblings found it hard. They just didn't find it hard at the exact same time. Mine was really heavy right away. And for them, I think their symptoms might have sort of snuck up on them more over time.
Yeah, I'm so curious on that, just as a sibling, because I've got one brother.
Yeah.
And he often doesn't ask me for advice, until the lesson's right upon him and weighing him down. Yeah. But I'm curious with your siblings, knowing what you know and your experience, did they come to you at different times? Have they sought out your expertise?
Great question. I think one of the things that my siblings had to do, even everybody was so worried about me when I was sick, which I found really irritating. Instead of loving, I look at it now as loving. I mean, one of the things they had to do was let me make my own decisions about my own care. And because I did know best. And I think that was really hard for some of them. I think some of them wanted to be the expert in the field.
Sure.
But, I think I would say in reality, I'm the middle child. I think my siblings we run down the age group, meaning like the older ones are the wisest ones, and then down the line,
It's funny that, isn't it?
Yeah. And I do, there are some ways in which my siblings have come to me for mental health help, but not as much as all my friends and family and all my friends and their family and all my husband's friends and their families, that there are very few people who haven't called on me at some point, and I keep it all in the vault to ask about someone or to ask about resources for someone. And I'm always really grateful to be able to help.
Yeah. Wow. Man, family dynamic. That's a whole nother conversation.
Well, so that's it, right? Like in my book, Can Anyone Tell Me? I talk about the brain and the body, and then I also talk about relationships and how they get all wonky. And I talk about things like identity and spirituality, because people they have real disruptions in all those places. Talk about going back to work and whether or not you should be dating, and is it okay to move, and when should you go through all the things, because those are questions that people ask over and over and over again. And of course, your question about your life is not externalized in me. I do not have your answers, but I can think through the question with you and help you experiment in sort of titrated pieces. Maybe like if you want to move across the country, maybe we just take a trip across the country first. I'm not going to stop you from moving, but let's just see, like, you have an idea that might be what you want to do. Let's test that hypothesis before we go all in on it. And then if you come back and you're like, oh my God, it was amazing, maybe we take that information and we move forward to the next step. But I think that the elements of how grief shows up we also sort of think, I've said this to you before. I used to call the podcast, my podcast, Grief is My Side Hustle. Its original name was Grieve is a Verb. I really wanted to know, how do you grieve? Because I had so many men come in and say, I didn't grieve. And what they meant was I didn't cry. That's what they meant.
Yes.
They absolutely grieved. They bought a building in their mother's name. They cleaned out all their father's closets and gave all his suits to the younger members of the family. I mean, they grieved, but they didn't cry. And I think a lot of or they cried very little. And I think a lot of what we think of grief is some big demonstrative outburst of sadness that we do maybe once or twice according to the movies. And then we have, grieved.
Yeah. Oh man, this comes up often about, I just think what Hollywood's done for our idea of grief and loss, it wrecked me. I can just vividly, and I've shared this on podcasts before, I'll probably just keep sharing this thought, because in that moment when I called the policeman back and I got the news and I delivered it to my family, in my mind was this highlight reel of all of the grief I'd seen in reactions in movies. And should I choose that reaction or should I choose this reaction? It wasn't naturally what was inside of me as to what should have come out. Should I kick and scream? That's what I see, and that's what I've seen in all these movies. And man, it just messed me up. And so I think then processing that afterwards was like, how should I act, like Ryan? How should Ryan grieve versus Denzel Washington, or somebody else?
Right, because often, there are some movies that do a really beautiful job. They're usually like smaller indie movies, or there's TV shows that one episode, they really do a nice job of sort of like showing a particular way of grieving that isn't always highlighted. But I think in general, culturally, I've had people say to me like, oh, we want you to come and teach your course, but can you call it something other than grief? Because people don't like grief. And, then I have to weigh is it better to be able to teach the course, or is it more important to use the correct language so that we're immediately sort of changing the view of culture? I don't know where I land on it, but I do think Hollywood has gotten this really bogus pass on, they don't just do it with grief. They do it with childbirth. They do it with weddings. They do it with sex. They make it all seem like this very simplistic. But the harm in grief is that if you haven't been through it, your mind really goes to what people have told you and your brain is trying to predict for you. What is this going to be like? Sure. And so there is this very weighted responsibility of in that book or in that movie, the person went on their husband died, and then 10 days later they went on a date. So I thought it was just going to take 10 days. And I wish Hollywood held itself more accountable for actually creating the culture around grief and loss and to getting better educated. I do think there are some shows, the show Succession last year, there's a significant death in the last season, and they do a really wildly good job of showing what it looks like to be in shock, and how people behave in shock. It's only just one scene. The whole show is so crazy and all the people on it are so crazy, but there is one scene where I was like, man, they just absolutely nailed it. So good. Cool.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there are more things coming out that do depict it far more accurately. Probably because the producer's gone through it themselves, they understand it, or something along those lines. And
I think we are craving more honest conversation, and I think we are craving I don't want the lies. I don't want and when people say the things out loud that I think are sort of lies, like, oh, well, it's different after a year. It's different for some people after a year. I really do try to sort of challenge it. What I want is for people to have enough information that everybody challenges it. That it's like when, we thought the world was round, we thought the world was flat, and then we understood it was round. You would never let someone still talk about it like we weren't on a globe. Once it was understood, you wouldn't be
I'm not even going to go there.
Yeah, you know, like I'm not going to just let you have that. The world is a globe.
Yes.
Like we have better information, and we aren't able. We haven't quite broken through, so that has become like core. I think we're getting closer. I feel really hopeful. And I think even though I don't love everything that's on social media, the fact that every single day I see another account that's like popping open where someone is using it, you know, at least to talk about grief, if not
using it for good. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, we started on, the physical devastation of grief, and we ended on flat earthers.
Exactly. The flat earthers.
And that's what happens when we have these conversations. But I love that we opened the can of relationships as well. So I reckon we have to do a part 3 at some point, because
I'm here for it.
Our first episode last year, our first episode together was our second best, most listened episode.
And so God, that is wild.
So that's the coolest thing to celebrate. And so I'm going to make sure that episode is in the description for all of our faithful listeners who have reached an hour into the conversation. You're amazing. And if you've loved this, please do a couple of things. You can choose. And this may be hard when you're grieving, because I know, but you can pick from the buffet. Go buy Meghan's book, Can Anyone Tell Me? Like or rate this podcast. That would be amazing. And just know that it's going to be okay. And Meghan's going to be here for you. Kaylee and I are going to be here for you. And we're going to do it together. So,
oh, God, I love that so much. And you can also listen to the book. I have found that people... It's not me reading this book. I wasn't able to do the recording, but I think somehow it's gentler sometimes for people, and the way that we process the information can feel encouraging. So if you can't read it, you could also listen to it. Give it a try. If it doesn't work, then it wasn't meant to be.
So good. I appreciate you. I look forward to more videos of Winston Chocolate Lab.
Absolutely. And more travel videos from you. And you just tell me when you want to do part 3 about relationships, and I'll be back.
100%.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Thanks.